Good evening. Welcome to Sharper Focus, Wider Lens, a forum sponsored by the Honors College at Michigan State University. I'm Cynthia Jackson Elmore, Dean of the Honors College, and tonight we are going to talk about It's All About Politics. Our forum tonight is co-sponsored by the College of Communication Arts and Sciences, the College of Social Science, James Madison College, the Residential College in the Arts and Humanities, the Department of Advertising and Public Relations, the Department of Economics, the Department of English, and the Department of Political Science. I also would like to acknowledge my colleagues, John Beck, who comes up with all the great topics and finds our speakers, Stephanie Sepak, who is Communications Manager for the Honors College. We have the wonderful team from the Alumni Association that does the live streaming, and I understand we have the state news here tonight. And so for everyone who comes to participate in this, I have to actually really give a warm welcome and thank you to all of our participants who come out to every single forum. We appreciate their participation. To everyone that's watching us over the live stream, we thank you for being here tonight. And I'm going to share with you the possible discussion topics you may hear from our panelists tonight, introduce them all to you, and make sure you understand that the purpose of tonight is to give you snippets into the research of the various individuals. We're not going to solve the world's problems tonight, and we don't intend to. But we are going to start a dialogue that we hope continues, and part of the reason we do this is to celebrate our own people here on campus, people that you can interact with in the community, potentially in a classroom, and get to know more about what they're doing, and for our colleagues to learn more about each other. And so on tonight, Ann Larrabee could talk about research on anarchist cookbooks, freedom of speech and terror laws, or government response to terrorism. And why I say could is we have like a pre-planning meeting where we figure out how all the different topics could relate together and what they might be, and out of that comes really rich discussion. I should put a disclaimer. The panelists don't have to make connections between their talks. That's my job. So we'll see how good a job I do. They just have to tell you about their work. Donna Rich Kaplowitz may talk about the Cuba economic embargo, current thoughts on Cuba in the US presidential race, and what's to come next in Cuba. Mike Colarisi may discuss border issues, international rivalries, scare tactics used in international relations, and maybe secrecy. And Bob Kalt may discuss with us this evening advertising's value and effectiveness in the marketplace during the US presidential race. To my far right is Ann Larrabee, a professor in the Department of English in the College of Arts and Letters. Dr. Larrabee's most recent work has involved the relationships among technology, culture, and media. Her book, Decade of Disaster, published in 2000, examined cultural responses to technological disasters. She's currently working on a historical study of bomb making among radical groups and exploring issues of technology transfer, constitutional restraints on speech, and the institutional boundaries placed around dangerous knowledge and instruction. With Professor Arthur Versluis, Ann is co-editor of the Journal for the Study of Radicalism, featuring interdisciplinary scholarly work on global radical movements. Dr. Larrabee is considered an expert on the history of terrorism and has contributed to the formation of the historiography of this emerging field, and earned her doctorate from Binghamton University. Donna Kaplowitz, to my immediate right, is an assistant professor in the Residential College in the Arts and Humanities. Donna's research interests have focused on US policy toward Cuba, the US embargo on Cuba, and Cuban foreign policy. She has published widely, and her book credits include The Cuba Read, The Making of a Revolution, The Anatomy of a Failed Embargo, US Sanctions Against Cuba, and Cuba's Ties to a Changing World. Donna recently traveled to Cuba as part of an honors research seminar and freshman seminar abroad, and she's long been interested in civic engagement and service learning at the university level, and previously taught at American University before coming here to Michigan State University. Her courses in ARCA focus on both Cuba as well as the intersections of social justice and civic engagement in working with local youth. And she earned her doctorate from Johns Hopkins University. To my immediate left is Mike Colarisi, a professor in the Department of Political Science within the College of Social Science. Mike began teaching here at Michigan State University in 2004. His research and teaching interests involve the domestic politics of international conflict, the dynamics of conflict between rival states, and time series analysis. Mike has published 2 books, Scare Tactics, The Politics of International Rivalry, and Strategic Rivalries in World Politics, Space, Position, and Escalation. His current projects explore the tension between national security-related secrecy and democratic accountability, the variation in legislative oversight on national security issues across democracies, the institutional causes of genocide and state failure, the statistical analysis of text, and the application of time series I can read, I just can't speak tonight. Time series methodology to non-continuous data. Mike earned his doctorate from Indiana University. And to my far left is Bob Colt, an instructor in the Department of Advertising and Public Relations in the College of Communication, Arts, and Sciences. In addition to teaching at MSU since 1993, Bob is president and CEO of Colt Communications Incorporated, which has been recognized over the years with numerous awards for outstanding work, and today the firm provides counsel to a prestigious list of clients. Bob has been active as a media strategist for several statewide ballot issues and worked as a media consultant and key political advisor to former Governor James J. Blanchard and former Secretary of State Richard H. Austin. Prior to founding Colt Communications, Bob did communications work for the Michigan Department of Transportation and Michigan Department of Treasury. Bob also worked for a number of years as a news anchor and corresponded for WZZM-TV 13 ABC in Grand Rapids, as well as WWTV, WWUP-TV 9 and 10, CBS in Northern Michigan. He earned his master's degree from Michigan State University. And I should also offer that after you've heard from all the panelists, we'll have a little bit of crosstalk. I'll do a summary, and when we open it up to the floor, you are not restricted to what they presented on. You are restricted to the topic of politics, but any questions, really fair game. And so with that in mind, I want to turn to my colleague, Professor Larrabee.
Thank you very much, Pauline. And let me just say that it's wonderful seeing you all here, because I'm going to pose a problem tonight, and the problem requires democratic citizenship to solve it. My talk is based on my book, The Wrong Hands, Popular Weapons Manuals and Their Historic Challenges to a Democratic Society, published by Oxford University Press. And by popular weapons manuals, that's what I call these works. In the media, they're called anarchist cookbooks or mayhem manuals or bomb-making manuals. And I talk about these kinds of texts and why people write them, how they incorporate technical information, and then I look at a history of how these texts have been introduced in court cases and used on evidence lists by the police. So I'll begin. I'll begin with, I'll go back a few years to the Boston Marathon case. Now, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was just tried and is now serving a death sentence for the Boston Marathon bombing. And in the evidence that was presented in that court case, you can see this FBI photograph of fireworks that have been emptied of their powder that was used to make the bombs that were used in the Boston Marathon bombing. These were pressure cooker bombs. This substance it was packed into pressure cookers and attached to a detonator, and those were the bombs used in the Boston Marathon bombing. So right after the bombing, the FBI released pictures of the remains of the pressure cooker, and there was instant speculation online about where the Tsarnaevs had gotten their ideas for making these kinds of bombs, how they managed to do this and cause such devastation and destruction. And you can see this publication. This is an Al-Qaeda publication called Inspire. This is the first issue. It's a rather slick online publication produced by Al-Qaeda. It includes calls for martyrdom and justifications for martyrdom. And you can see at the bottom there on the right, there's an article called Make a Bomb in the Kitchen of Your Mom. And it's signed by the AQ chef. These kinds of instructional texts are often called recipes. So the reference to the chef is significant in that way. It makes them seem almost benign when they actually include quite an intense level of technical information and potential destruction. So if you go into that publication, Inspire, you'll see that Make a Bomb in the Kitchen of Your Mom is called Open Source Jihad. And so this is the first image that we see before we begin to see the instructions. And this is an interesting image to me because you'll see that how to make a bomb in the kitchen of your mom is placed over a cityscape, suggesting that you'll be making a secret lab within the city, and also how the city might also be the target of destruction. So the instructions begin with this, open source jihad, and it gives a definition. A resource manual for those who loathe the tyrants, includes bomb-making techniques, security measures, guerrilla tactics, weapons training, and all other jihad-related activities. Now, if you take out the word jihad, this is very, very familiar rhetoric in these kinds of instruction manuals that go back for many decades. This isn't particularly new. It's just been given a new kind of language. And the other new thing that it's been given, in the old days, before the digital world, these instructions were often just textual. In fact, they looked kind of like recipes. But now the information is accompanied by photographs that allow a would-be bomb maker to follow the photographs rather than have to try to sort through text. And so even somebody who, say, can't read English, because there is a version of this publication in English, they're able to follow the directions rather easily. Now, that doesn't mean that it's easy to make a bomb. In fact, it's quite difficult and it's quite dangerous. But these instructions often offer that it's easy. So as I said, these texts go back for a really long time. The first one to appear in a court case was called The Science of Revolutionary Warfare, which was published in 1885. And it was written by an anarchist, Johann Most, he went around the country giving lectures on how workers should take revenge or overthrow the tyrants. And so his directions included information on how to make dynamite, on how to make nitroglycerin, on how to pack this into bombs. It even had some rather odd recipes. For example, it suggested that you could make extract ptomaine from corpses and use that to poison people. So this manual was introduced at the trial of 4 anarchists who were accused of throwing a bomb at a rally, which killed 8 police officers. Now, these 4 anarchists were eventually posthumously pardoned, but during the court case, text, the Science of Revolutionary Warfare, was read for an entire afternoon. In fact, they kept the court longer than usual just reading passages from this text. Now, the thing is, the Science of Revolutionary Warfare had absolutely nothing to do with the actual bomb making. It wasn't a bomb that you could find in Science of Revolutionary Warfare. But because some of the defendants owned Science of Revolutionary Warfare, it was presented in court to give a picture of them as being engaged in a kind of malevolent activity. And this is a quote from Science of Revolutionary Warfare. "Just think if this bomb had been placed under the table of a gluttonous dinner party, what a beautiful effect it would have had." So you can kind of hear how threatening this was at the time. And this is to the right on the bottom, this is a picture of Johann Most, and you can see right after this, anarchists become very much associated with bomb throwing, even though anarchy was a quite complex philosophy of the day. But suddenly you see Emma Goldman, another very famous anarchist, you see Johann Most, and their heads are in the kind of archetypal bomb, and this has become the archetype of the bomb, which you see everywhere, right? The globe with the fuse coming out of it. Okay, so over the decades, since 1885, there have been a bunch of these kinds of publications, and they cross the political spectrum from the extreme left to the extreme right. Radical groups have produced these kinds of manuals. Now, usually they're not really intended for anyone to make actual weapons. What they're written for is to provoke the government into some kind of action, and to also get people to imagine that these groups have more power than they really have. These texts are not really very useful in actual bomb-making activity. But the government has tried off and on to try to suppress these texts, these manuals. Now, the first way that it happens is through government censorship. There have been congressional hearings on trying to find a way to eliminate these texts, to stop publishers from printing them, getting them offline. But censorship has never held up. Because our rights to produce these and read these kinds of texts are constitutionally protected. Now, there's been a recent erosion of that, which we can talk about. Now, the other way that these texts are used is in police profiling. Now, it's very, very common, and there are numerous court cases where police investigators will go into a home of a suspect and collect whatever's on their bookshelf, and then use the most telling kinds of titles, like Science of Revolutionary Warfare, or The Anarchist Cookbook, or How to Make Homemade Detonators. And they'll collect these kind of books, and then those books will be introduced in court. Now that people are collecting lots of information on their hard drives, it's quite common for investigators to sweep up the entire contents of hard drives, comb through them for the most damning kinds of titles, damning texts and evidence, and then to put those forward as evidence in court. Now, these texts have an uneven life in the courts. Sometimes judges will allow them, and sometimes they won't. And as I said, this is quite uneven, and it depends on what the group is. For example, the Hutari, who is the group from southern Michigan, who they were accused of planning to attack police at a funeral. All of their books were collected, including fiction that they had read, but also different kinds of weapons making manuals that they had. And the judge did not allow those in court. The federal prosecutors were trying to prove that they were guilty of sedition, and they could not make that case stick. The judge said that these texts, you can't really just pick up people's reading material and say that it says something about them. For example, you probably have lots of books on your bookshelf that you've never even read, or stuff in your hard drive that you've never read. So the reading material in the courts is is a kind of, as I said, an uneven thing. Some judges will allow them. And then these texts are used to, as with the Haymarket trial, to create a kind of very damaging view of the suspects. This has actually been getting more and more common in cases that involve Muslims who are accused of terrorist cases. And there actually is a law by which people can be convicted of simply circulating bomb-making information for use in a federal crime. And what we're seeing more and more is that in cases in which Muslims are accused of some kind of terrorist planning, that these texts are introduced more and more and allowed more and more. Another way to try to deal with these texts is to keep them from circulating. And so, for example, libraries, which have always defended the right to read, and they've defended these kinds of texts, they may choose not to carry these books. Or social networking sites like YouTube or something like that may refuse to host videos that show how to make bombs. And to me, that's perfectly legitimate. There's no reason why YouTube should be carrying bomb-making instructions. It's perfectly within their rights not to do that. And so to me, the way to deal with these kinds of texts is within this kind of realm, is just to refuse to circulate them rather than to have government selecting who is allowed to have these texts and who is not, and also to have them introduced into courts in kind of uneven and unfair ways.
Thank you, Anne. We will now turn to Professor Kaplowitz.
Okay, I'll start my time.
I haven't started your time yet. You're good.
Screen, right? Okay.
Grab the mic.
Oh, mic. Is this just travel like that? Okay. Can you hear me? Great. So I am going to talk about U.S.-Cuban relations, which at any given time over the last 32 years of my life has been always interesting to me. And I think it's actually really interesting right now. I would tell you probably any time you talk to me it was interesting, but given President Obama's recent trip, I think my goal tonight is to share with you the fact that we are actually in unprecedented territory in terms of U.S. policy toward Cuba. And what I'm going to do is jump back in history for a minute and then move up to what's happening today and maybe give some projections about what I expect is we're going to see in the near future. Just a moment on my own background. I had the opportunity back in 1984 when I had just graduated from college to go to Cuba. It was a time when U.S. citizens were not going to Cuba at all, and I was selected by the American Friends Service Committee to go on a summer program there. With the purpose of improving dialogue between the two countries. I got to live in Cuban homes, talk in Cuban churches, and cut Cuban sugarcane. And I had an absolutely amazing experience that was particularly enlightening to me because I had had the opportunity prior to my trip to Cuba to travel in other Latin American countries. And what I saw in Cuba in 1984 was an egalitarian country, which actually now, when we look back at the 80s in Cuba, Cuba's been recognized as the most egalitarian country on earth by reporters who have studied this. So I was incredibly interested in what was happening there and really wondered if there might be some lessons we could learn from the Cuban experiment that could help solve some of the entrenched poverty that I saw in Latin America. It kept me coming back. I've been to Cuba probably 20 or 30 times over the last 32 years. I've written a number of books. I've testified before the US Senate. I teach courses. I take MSU faculty and students to Cuba. And I've met Fidel Castro. As you can see, that's when we were both a lot younger. And I've met Raul Castro, and I've met Ramon. There's actually another brother who actually just passed away. And I suspect that it may be these meetings that led to a knock on my door here in East Lansing shortly after I moved here by the FBI, who was coming to talk to me about who I know in Cuba. So jump ahead, last month, President Obama, I'm sure nobody missed it, landed in Havana, and he reversed hundreds of years of U.S. foreign policy. I sat in my house and watched this happening with tears literally streaming down my face. U.S. Policy toward Cuba has been one of intervention from the moment, actually way before Cuba became a nation. We had a policy called the Monroe Doctrine in 1823 that said that we, the U.S., had the right to intervene in Latin America against European powers. But in terms of Cuba specifically, Cuba had been fighting its own war of independence for 30 years. It was on the verge of winning its war of independence. The U.S. jumped in in the last 3 months of that war. You may have heard of Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. That's where this comes from. And the U.S. Declared victory after 3 months of being on the island and called the war the Spanish-American War, eliminating Cuba even from the title. And from that moment on, the U.S. ensured that our interests were met 90 miles from our shore. As part of our agreement to withdraw our troops from Cuba after the war, we made Cuba something called the Platt Amendment that ensured that the U.S. could intervene at any time to protect our own interests. And it was also the moment in which we gained territory in Cuba, Guantanamo Naval Base. So we've had it since 1901. Story has it that after Fidel came to power, he refused to cash the $4,000 checks that the U.S. sends every year, and that he has a stack of checks dating back to 1959. U.S. basically controlled what was happening in Cuba between 1901 and 1959 when Fidel Castro came to power. And shortly after he came to power, the U.S. Decided that we couldn't live with that man in Havana, and so we started a covert operation that had been established by the Eisenhower administration and carried out by the new Kennedy administration. As you all probably know from your history books, it didn't turn out well for the U.S. The Cubans repelled us at the shores of the Bay of Pigs, and we then moved into Operation Mongoose, which was a policy of trying to assassinate Fidel Castro in the most incredibly creative ways. There have been over 600 attempts on his life, including things like exploding cigars and poisonous seashells when he goes scuba diving. Obviously, those haven't worked either. Since 1961, we've had an embargo on Cuba, and that actually continues to this very day. So just a very bit about the embargo. The main goal of our embargo, which means that we did not allow any trade with the island, and we still limit significantly our trade, the main goal was to overthrow Fidel Castro. Clearly, that goal was not achieved. Other goals of the embargo included retaliation for nationalizations of U.S. property. Clearly, if we were tightening the screws on Cuba, they were not going to be able to pay for the nationalizations. We also wanted to contain Cuban expansionism. Cuba was looking to support revolutions in other countries, and during the period of the time that the embargo was most multilateral, this was actually also the time that Cuba was most active overseas. We wanted the embargo to break Soviet-Cuban ties, but clearly when you stop trading with your closest neighbor, you're sending them over to the other side. And so we ensured that Cuba and Soviet ties were very close. Finally, and really important even today, is the fact that we imposed the embargo for domestic political reasons. I often shudder during presidential seasons, campaign seasons, because mostly for many years, U.S. policy toward Cuba has been formulated on the campaign trail in South Florida, where Miami Cubans have controlled the vote. What's happened recently is that the Cuban American community is no longer monolithic, and many Cubans actually support travel. Many of them return to the island. And so we're seeing a change in that respect as well. So U.S. policy toward Cuba remained pretty consistent through the 80s. And Cuba was, like I said, an egalitarian country when I first visited in 1984. Cuba faced a crisis of monumental proportion in in the early 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed, and they didn't really see it coming. Their economy shrunk by 34%, basically overnight. This is unthinkable to us, higher than the Great Depression here. Cuban friends of mine that I've made, that I've had friends, for 30 years, knew things that they had never experienced, like hunger. There wasn't enough food. There were blackouts, sometimes for 8 hours a day. There were health issues that emerged. One of my good friends lost 30 pounds because he could not, he couldn't get gas for his car, so he had to walk to work, and his diet was severely limited. These were really, really hard times in Cuba. But Cuba survives. And how does Cuba survive? It's really, really interesting. First of all, and probably surprising to some in the US, is that Fidel is incredibly charismatic. And so he's able to rally Cubans around the revolution and continue to get their support. He calls this period of time, instead of "we're really screwed," he calls it the special period in time of peace. And that's how Cubans continue to refer to this really difficult time. The other thing to remember is that the Cuban Revolution is homegrown. That means that it was not imposed on Cuba by the Soviet Union like many of the Soviet satellites. And so the Cubans sat on their Caribbean island and watched what was happening in Eastern Europe and saw these countries falling apart and said, no, we're not going to go that way. We're going to keep to our commitments of revolution. And finally, Fidel at that time introduced some economic reform that helped people. For example, there were urban gardens planted everywhere, farmers markets, some self-employment was initiated at this period of time. Fidel falls sick in 2006. There's always rumors that Fidel's died in South Florida. This time he was very sick, and his brother Raul takes over. For many of us who've watched Cuba for so long, we know Raul. He comes from the military, and we were really concerned that he's not the charismatic man that his brother is, and he's very in the box kind of a thinker. And we were very, very surprised to see that he actually initiates amazing change in Cuba. He takes, from 2008, where he officially takes over, he says Cuba has to change or perish. We have to do something different. So he initiates political and economic reforms. He accepts responsibility for Cuba's problems. So whereas Fidel, once upon a time, always blamed everything on the US embargo, Raul says, no, we have to look internally and figure out what's going on inside. He initiates massive grassroots discussions all across the island in every venue. Cubans are talking about what they need to do to improve their economy. And then there's political openings, things like cell phones and internet, which I can tell you is very hard to come by. Even today in Cuba, but it was beginning to open. Travel, Cubans can travel abroad. Term limits also come into play. In fact, Raul is stepping down in 2018. He also initiates a series of economic reforms. He shifts to from the centrally planned economy to a 40% private sector now. He initiates private business, like in the top slide, there's people who have refurbished old US cars and they use them as taxis, and people are opening restaurants in their homes that are on par with almost any major capital in the world. There's joint ventures with foreign companies and a number of other measures that are introduced to Cuba that change the economy. So in comes 2014, December 17th, I'm having coffee with one of my students and I get a text on my phone. At that moment, Raul Castro and Obama were jointly announcing a change in US-Cuban relations. They announced the normalization of US-Cuban relations, and we subsequently opened embassies in each other's capitals. And US policy shifts because the embargo policy did not work. Cuba has been accepted into the family of nations, and the US is increasingly seen as the pariah who's not going along with efforts to remove the embargo. The UN has voted for the last 10 years, 188 to 2 against the US embargo. US businesses are telling us, our government, that they want to trade. South Florida is no longer the political bloc that it once was. And Obama is able to frame Cuba as the crowning achievement of his presidency. So Obama arrives in Havana with two main goals when he touched down last month. First, he wanted to make sure that the US policy of intervention, that Cubans understood that US policy of intervention was over. He was not going to abide by it. And he says, I've made it clear that the U.S. has neither the capacity nor intention to impose change on Cuba. That was very significant for a Cuban audience. The second goal was to make sure that this new rapprochement was not going to change once he left office. And he did this through bringing lots of businesses into Cuba, U.S. businesses, continuing to loosen travel, and to make it cool to visit Cuba. The large majority of population in the U.S. support normalization of relations with Cuba. So where do we go from here? I believe that Obama's rapprochement with Cuba, this new change in 200 years of policy, is here to stay. I think the genie's out of the bag. I don't think that whoever wins the White House in November is going to be able to change that. I think it's good for U.S. businesses and U.S. citizens to be able to travel, and I think it's good for Cuban citizens to have access to U.S. ideas. There's a number of things that still remain to be resolved, for example, the embargo, Guantanamo, property claims, and Cuba also has a lot of obstacles they're facing. Right now, as we sit here, the Cubans are concluding their 7th Party Congress, and we're going to hear tomorrow much of what I say may be obsolete. We're going to hear where they think their country is going after today. But one thing that I do know for sure is that the egalitarian country that I fell in love with in 1984 is basically no longer in existence. There's growing inequality with all of these new market reforms. And yet I also think that I support the changes because I believe that the Cuban people know their way through this. And I think Obama's made really important changes in U.S. policy. Thank you.
So now we're going to have Professor Colorisi. Press it and hold it for about 3 seconds.
How about now? All right. I just waited for it to come up most of the way, just for you. So thank you. It's wonderful to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about something that is research that's ongoing for me and I've been doing for a while. Usually I study politics using math and data, but there's going to be no math and data in here, so hopefully no one falls asleep. The first version I did of this, and I showed to my kids, and they're like, "Dad, you can't do that. And if you do it, we'll change our name." So I'm hoping to do better here. Specifically, as you research things, sometimes you see things out in the world that worry you or concern you. And that's really kind of what I'm going to talk about today, a little bit about current events, things I see in elections that touch on my research, and that I think we all need to think about some more. And specifically, that research is about secrecy in democracies. And I research how secrecy warps accountability in democracy and what that means for international relations, for our understandings of surveillance and effectiveness in national security. And really, I think one of the things we can think about is that as we look at the election season, we think about the messages and the communication strategies that are out there, or even in our own heads and thinking about policy around the world, that there's a lot of doubts about the U.S. position and policy, right? So we can think about this on surveillance after the Snowden leaks, and polarization about what this means, right? And whether we're for or against certain NSA strategies or other things, right? Investment in NATO, right? Is it obsolete, or is it a very important part of cooperation in the future? Right? What do we do about counterterrorism and threats? Right? All of these things are very polarizing issues in the U.S. And there's actually a lot of doubt. I'm not saying everyone doubts, but there's a lot of doubt in the U.S. about whether current policies or current policies that are being promoted are the right way to go. Okay, and I'm not going to tell you one policy is good or one policy is bad. What I'm actually interested in is what happens when people disagree about these things, right? And then how do we build consensus and move forward, okay? So worrisome to me in my research is I see doubts rising about policy, right? And significant doubt. There's not a consensus about foreign policy largely in the U.S. And this is happening at the same time when challenges are also rising to the U.S. right? And I'm not going to tell you that, China and the US are definitely going to be rivals in the future, right? They could be friends, but there's worries, right? Particularly when we're talking about, Asia. There's worries about Japan and Korea and whether the US can reassure allies, right, that they have their interests, that we are committed to the region. There's been recent bellicose actions, by Russia, and Russia would say there's been bellicose actions by the US, right? There's potential rising challenges of a second Cold War, right, that could be erupting. And then we have the more salient concern, I think, in many people's minds of terrorism and ISIS and other things. So there's these real challenges out there. And the question is, how do we come together as a nation and convince each other which policies are going to meet these challenges, okay? And my research, to a large extent, is about how difficult that tends to be in a democracy. That the way accountability in democracy should work is that we talk about things, that there's a marketplace of ideas, and we hash out different things, and we figure out what works and what doesn't work. And when things don't work, we change, right, what we do, and we learn from it, right? We learn through information and feedback because the public, right, and elites and other people have a discussion about these things. At least that's how it's supposed to work, right? But national security often demands secrecy. We have much, much less information when it comes to national security policies, right, on NATO, on interventions, on humanitarian interventions even, right, and particularly on counterterrorism policy, right? And the question is, right, how do we work these things out? How do we convince each other about which policies, right, to be relatively unified and less polarized as a country and move forward when we have this secrecy? Well, sometimes it's not so bad. Right? Sometimes there's this trust trapdoor, as I like to call it, right? That you can give the government secrets, and if you trust them, and we kind of, understand that, we think we're okay with what they're doing, right? The public supports those current investments, right? So we invest in NATO, right, and other things. These challenges can potentially be met. But as anyone who's ever given keys to a teenager knows to the car, right, trust can be abused, right? And that's also true in secrecy. That when you give the executive discretion to keep secrets, they not only can keep secrets, right, that you would want them to keep about suppressing enemy capabilities, right, deceiving a potential competitor, anticipating a harm that might happen, right, but they can also hide incompetence. They can also hide the costs of policies, therefore we can't learn what's good policy and bad policy. And we're just not in this trust trapdoor now, as I think everyone understands and knows, right? Trust in government is at an all-time low, right? The last time the National Election Survey asked the same question it's been asking since 1958, less than 19% of the US public, right, believe that the government did the right thing even most of the time. It's not even all of the time, right? Even most of the time. The numbers differ on different policy issues, but they're still very low for national security. So we're not all trusting, okay? So we have disagreements, we have polarization, and we have real challenges and problems. And some of my research is thinking about, well, what do we do? Right? So how do we unwind this? How do we convince, given that, we're not going to get rid of, secrecy, we're not going to get rid of distrust, right, instantly, right? But what can we do to think about this? And so I want to talk very briefly about one case, so how we got this distrust, and I think the case of actually Apple and surveillance is actually very, very telling for what causes this distrust and then maybe helps us unwind it at the same time. Right? And so we can see the cycle of distrust to some extent when the Snowden revelations come. And Tim Cook, the Apple CEO, talks about this quite readily. They were cooperating with the government on counterterrorism investigations before the Snowden revelations came out. But when they came out, right, suddenly they realized that the government was doing things that they couldn't believe, right? That the government, they would argue, didn't value transactional security in the same way they did, right? So they thought their interests were somehow now different than the government's interests. Well, that's a level of distrust, right? When you don't think that someone's sharing your interests and you're giving them secret powers, right? That could be reason to worry. And so they now distrust the government motives in ways that they didn't previously, right? So this has led to polarization on their part. Some people think Apple's wrong. Some people think Apple's right in what they did. But then the government, in turn, then distrusts these doubters, right? Why aren't they helping us? Don't they care about security, right? Why aren't they helping? And now we see Microsoft has entered, so they've just recently sued the government as part of government policies on surveillance, particularly. Right, so there's this cycle of distrust, I think, that comes from these interests being disaligned, right? Not trusting that somebody, when they, or the government in particular, are going to use these national security powers for your own interests or in ways that you would like them to produce security, right, in those ways. And so I think that then helps us think a little about what's broken today and maybe even how to fix it. Okay? And that when we think about how we can potentially generate trust, right, one way is we need the government to be able to reveal information on incompetence and reveal information, right, when things are wrong and the cost. So again, we can get back to this idea of the marketplace of ideas and learning about things, right? The government has to be open to scrutiny, right? So if we don't already trust, right, one way to build trust is to say, if I let you fall, right, there's a penalty I would pay, right? Therefore, it's in my interest to do this, even if you don't believe that, you and I, right, share these same core values. And that's very, very important, I think, right, that there is a potential penalty for abuse, power, or incompetence. And so, what we can build is more effective oversight of the executive. And I'll talk a little bit more of that. I quite like the picture up there, because I think that's exactly what we get wrong right now. So Congress was doing an investigation of torture, right? And the CIA was literally spying on Congress. I mean, we know this. This is backwards, right? In some sense, the public needs to have the CIA goggles, right? And we need to rearrange these things for oversight. But I think generally, this is how it is right now. I don't think this is wrong, even though it's a cartoon. We can think about this in alliances and intervention. So doubts about NATO, and I'll go through this more quickly. It's the same thing, right? Do you think it's worth investing in NATO? There's lots and lots of different disagreements about this. Effective oversight here is even more difficult because now we're trying to oversee an international organization, right? And not just our own government, right? But we still need to solve these things. And I still think greater transparency in international organizations is something that could help unwind some of these tensions, skepticism, and distrust. And you don't just have to take my word for it, because we've done this before, right? So distrust and skepticism of the Vietnam War, great polarization, leaks and realizations of national security policies being abused in very controversial ways like COINTELPRO, right? We had Watergate, right? And the reaction to that was a real innovation in the US of what I would consider world-class oversight institutions. Freedom of information law was strengthened to better include national security information with smarter privacy protections in there, so it actually was useful to people to go out and use. And probably, most importantly, intelligence was subjected to specific oversight in Congress, right, after the Church Committee. So we had the Senate Select Committee and the House, and they were innovative. This was incredibly innovative institutions that the US came up with to solve a very practical problem, that we have a polarized public, and how can we bring people together, right, in informed and interesting ways. I think this really mirrors the way the world looks right now, right? There's lots of distrust and worries about the rendition program. Those are all the rendition planes that we know about. There could be more, right? Drones, right, on top of surveillance, and that doesn't leave out the Iraq War, right, and worries. And what institutional innovations have we come up with, right, in the face of these problems? Those are crickets, right? We haven't innovated ways of creating credible information, right, to assure people, right, or for the government to assure people that if they're messing up, right, if they're incompetent, if they're doing things wrong, that there's ways we will find out about it. What do we know about the rendition program? Torture to a large extent, right, or drones, comes from the executive. It's already sort of selected information. It doesn't come from relatively independent, investigations, right? Instead, we have this, right, continued polarization, right? And I think this is where this distrust, right, is all coming from. And a lot of it comes up in very emotional terms because it's people's values, okay? And I guess what I want to talk about is the challenges a little bit. And what I'd love to see public debate be more of is about how we solve these things. That yes, we disagree, right? And instead of ping-ponging back and forth about disagreement, right, realizing what sort of institutional structures and incentives we can build and give each other, right, to get past that, to rise to the joint challenges that lead to this emotion, right, and trouble, right? And so, the sort of takeaway message, I guess, right, is that, my research is really about, creating credible information, right, to try to counteract public polarization on national security, and why that's difficult on national security, but possible. So, thanks.
And Stephanie, when we get to play the ads, I'm going to ask you to hit the button on it because I don't want to mess those up. But I think I can do this. Hello, I'm Bob Colt, and I'm here to talk about politics. I really enjoy politics, watching it, researching it, and seeing how it affects our society. It really is all about politics. And I have my own public relations firm, Colt Communications. We also do a significant amount of advertising. I won't do as much political advertising in this election cycle. I do have a lot of office responsibilities and responsibilities here at the university now. That's my actual office where I spend most of my time. And thank you, Dean, for the wonderful introduction. I have been on faculty as a fixed-term instructor for 23 years. I started here at Michigan State when public relations was just one class. And as it's grown in the scientific research areas, we've had more and more students. And I teach 2 courses now, 3 classes of them, 260, which is an introduction to public relations, and 325, which is public relations techniques and ethics. And we talk about the use of advertising in political campaigns and other things. And even this fall, in a tradition that was started years ago by the former late Chuck Atkin in the College of Communication, in our College of Communication Arts and Sciences in the Communication Department, Chuck and I started a course of public relations and advertising in political campaigns, and we literally polluted our brains with all of the ads we could in all of the past elections as a research project. And it really was fun. In fact, now I find that I'm so warped, I actually have the clicker at home, clicking channels, going past the programs to watch the ads. And it's a great way, it's kind of sick, but it's a great way to learn about popular culture and how people communicate important messages, because they do get a lot of information from advertising. I do run my own firm and teach here. I was a television reporter for a number of years, and it was a long time ago. I didn't really like anchoring the newscast, although they asked me to do it too often. At the time, there were only 2 networks, if anyone here in the audience remembers, CBS and NBC, and the top-rated program when I was a news anchor was Bozo the Clown. So we only got 5 minutes to start to do the news, and then Bozo took over and would do the rest of the show, and that's what people watch TV for. Well, now with so many channels, news actually has become a product, and I kind of miss my role in media, but I learned a lot from it. And then I had a career in the Treasury and State Transportation Departments in Governor Blanchard's administration, and enjoyed it. We handled all of the revenue for the state of Michigan, and I was the spokesperson for all pensions and tax issues that would come up for the state. I also, as I've been teaching at Michigan State, I was asked to be the president of AARP, and I am a former president of AARP, and I would say that to any of those here in the audience or watching, it's a very small club to be a past living president of AARP. It's very elite. So I'm very honored. It's all been a good experience, and actually, for full disclosure, I'm a Democrat and a Hillary Clinton supporter. I like her. I wish more women liked her. She has some problems and issues in her campaign that she will overcome. But even though I'm a Democrat, Governor Snyder appointed me to the Michigan Community Service Commission. And we spend a significant amount of time, energy, and money in AmeriCorps funds that come through the state of Michigan, supporting volunteer programs. And it also it allowed me to be the past chair of the Capital Region Community Foundation, and we endow about $85 million in grants to charities. So that's me, and that's my office, and it's not for me. It's a nice place to work. It's not kind of the Trump Tower, but as close as we could probably get in Okemos, and it's a great place to work, but it's not for me. It's for people who come in and talk to me, and executives and folks that I work with. And I was young a long time ago. I even used these pictures to prove to my students that I was a kid once. And the middle picture was me in college, and I looked better back then with more hair. And when I was a television reporter, I had the opportunity to interview a lot of politicians, and that's one that I worked closely with. So I was young a long time ago, and in my years of wisdom, this is what I would want you to know, a few things you should know. People may say issues don't matter. And I've heard people say this often. Actually, a guest, former chair of the state Republican Party said this to my class. He says, issues don't matter. People aren't deciding election based on issues. Well, I think they do matter, but it's probably true they might not vote because of issues all the time. Image is important. And image is the short-term perception that we have of people or organizations. And reputation is probably the long-term perception. Perception is important. If you perceive it to be true, it is true to you in the absence of any other information. So reputation and image are important in campaigns. And I would tell you that negative advertising works. That's why you see it on television. Most people will end up voting for the politician who they think is least offensive, not for someone they support because of an issue. Usually what happens, there's so much negative advertising that occurs in a campaign, we call it the LOP theory, least objectionable person. People go into the voting booth, and just before they vote, they might not like this guy, or they might not like that woman, but who offends me less? And they are going to vote, and they've already made the commitment to be there, so they're going to cast their ballot. They may not like it. They don't have to. They still get the vote. So I wanted to do what I've talked about, share some ads with you in just the next couple of minutes, and Stephanie will help me. Okay, Stephanie's, I will rely on her knowledge of technology to help me, because we're only going to get one shot at playing these. We have actually had some really good ads that have changed society and the way that people perceive candidates. Here's what I would tell you for any criticism about Bernie Sanders: he's made old being cool. When he started his campaign, I kind of thought he was like the old person in the neighborhood who would always yell at the kids when the ball went on his yard. "Get off my lawn!" And he ranted and raved, but he's actually done a couple of things, including raise more money than Hillary Clinton. Why? Because issues do matter, and people who care about issues have contributed to his campaign. So in the next couple of minutes, I want to show you some revolutionary ads, and this was a very important first ad that people saw about Bernie Sanders in Iowa.
We'll marry our fortunes together. I've got some real estate here in my bag. Counting the bars on the New Jersey Turnpike. They've all come to look for America. All come to look for America.
Bernie Sanders, and I approve this message.
Now, did he talk about any issues? You didn't hear him talk about any issues. He didn't. He made an emotive rather than a cognitive argument in asking for votes. He said, look let's just all be for America, and it worked. It made him very successful. I'm going to show you just a couple of other ads. This is one that will be remembered because it was at a time in the Republican primary in Iowa where Donald Trump, who is a surprise to me, frankly, called Carly Fiorina ugly. And this is what she did.
Ladies, look at this face. And look at all of your faces. The face of leadership. The face of leadership in our party, the party of women's suffrage. The face of leadership in your communities, in your businesses, in your places of work and worship. Ladies, note to Democrat Party, we are not a special interest group, we are the majority of the nation.
Now we know that ad worked because it moved her from last place, somewhere in the middle of the pack, and when the debates went on, she kind of lost in the debates. She didn't really prove herself. I'm just going to show you a couple quick other ads. And you may or may not like these, but they're important to watch, and I'll tell you a little bit about them after we see them. Go ahead.
I mean, hey, I lived in New York City and Manhattan all my life, okay? So, my views are a little bit different than if I lived in Iowa.
They are different, like on abortion.
Would President Trump ban partial birth abortion?
Well, look, I am pro-choice in every respect.
And what does Trump think about Iowa?
How stupid are the people of Iowa?
Donald Trump, New York values, not ours.
My views are a little bit different than if I lived in Iowa.
I'm Ted Cruz, and I approve this message.
It's a very effective ad. Well, let's see an ad about Ted Cruz.
We probably have time for one final ad, the one we're
Good.
showing now.
And so let's go to the Donald Trump ad, because I think why has Donald Trump been successful? This will be a 60-second investment, may even be the 30. Why has he been successful? Because he's played to people's emotions, and they want a great country.
I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message.
The politicians can pretend it's something else, but Donald Trump calls it radical Islamic terrorism. That's why he's calling for a temporary shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until we can figure out what's going on. He'll quickly cut the head off ISIS and take their oil. And he'll stop illegal immigration by building a wall on our southern border that Mexico will pay for.
We will make America great again.
Well, I won't show you any
Donald
more
Trump,
ads.
and I approve this message.
I won't show you any more ads, but I'll be happy to hear any conversation you have, because I like to listen to people. I've enjoyed tonight's panel, and I've learned a lot, and I would appreciate any questions you have. I would leave you with this. You haven't seen anything yet. Put your seatbelt on, because we've got a great cast of characters. And if you like politics and can remove your own emotion from the campaign, it'll really be a great campaign to watch and hopefully appreciate. And I bet we'll have some good advertising.
Thank you, Bob. Okay, so I'm going to see if I can summarize across this, and I'll give you a little teaser. If after we've asked and answered all our questions, there's still time remaining and you want to stay and see some more ads, you can, all right? So across the topics, a couple of themes stood out to me. One is how things transcend over time, right? And the role that history plays in understanding the present and the future, and not losing sight of that. Anne talked about popular weapons manuals, bomb making, and it raises the question, is this free speech or terrorism? And what is the role of such manuals in a democracy such as which we live in? What's the role of social media in threats to government structures or threats to geopolitical institutions? Do they help spread the potential for these threats to grow and become reality? Are these manuals really protected texts, and are the activities that people undertake in reading them protected activities? Anne pointed out about how these manuals are really intended to provoke government action and not really allow someone to make an actionable bomb. It's about the dialogue that could happen. And so what does that tell us about the role of domestic terrorism, and when does it then cross boundaries and borders and become something more? Donna talked to us about watching a country go from being one of the most egalitarian on earth to growing in inequality, and the role that foreign policy has played in that. It also pointed out the role of presidents in setting foreign policy and setting the stage for how we interact with others, long and short term. And it pointed out the interventionist strategies that the United States has engaged in, which gives us something to think about for terrorism, again, because some of the things that come up tied to terrorism are tied to people feeling as though we've walked into their country and taken over and not respected culture. She talked about the economic embargoes, and we might think about how does this play out in other locales. There's been other countries that we've toyed with the idea of economic embargoes or gone down that route and walked it back, and laid out some of the unintended consequences which are inherent in any political decision, and how far down the line can we look to really try to get ahead of some of them and say, well, we don't want this to happen, but it's likely to happen, and so what do we do about it? And really pointing out the difference between a homegrown revolution and those that come about because of the actions of others in other countries. And what's the role of other world powers in what happens in any particular country? And what struck me was the role of individuals versus institutions. She pointed out when there were different leaders in place in Cuba, what did that mean, but also the structures that were in place. And I want to ask us, can we really separate economics from politics? And so how does that all play out? Then Mike talked about secrecy and how it warps international relations and how it's led to doubts in US stances and policies. So while we were once seen as the world leader and the country to trust, is that still the case? And what does that mean in today's changing global economy and geopolitical issues? The fact that there's a lack of consensus on US foreign policy, and how do we assure our allies that we're still good partners and they should stay in the game with us? How does and should democracy and accountability work? And we have to ask ourselves, are these things new, or are we just getting new revelations of things that happen all the time? And if they're new revelations and they happen all the time, is that okay? Or now that we know, does it suggest we should be acting differently? The idea about the marketplace came up across the talks, but in different ways. A marketplace for ideas, whether it's bomb making or protests or foreign relations, the marketplace for goods, how do those all interact? And what's the interactions between groups, the general public, government, and other countries? What are those intersectionalities and how do we come to terms with them? Bob pointed us to the use of advertising in political campaigns and pointed out that perception becomes reality. And for some of us, maybe the sad reality that negative advertising distracts from informed decision making. No longer do we see the issues coming to the forefront and an ability to really get at what's a candidate about. It's all tied to emotions and scare tactics and what makes us feel good. So how does the campaign cycle in and of itself and advertising affect our ability to make decisions about how we will govern ourselves, how we will come together as a society, and how we will interact with others? And so it really is all politics, and political scientists, I'll include Mike in this, even though he's talking about international relations, will often want to say all politics are local. Well, as we sit in the presidential year, we realize that all politics aren't really local. We've got some national and international issues we've got to deal with, and if we don't wrestle with them, we may find ourselves even further isolated, and how do we come to terms with what does that mean as we see ourselves losing our place in the world power status? So kind of with that as an overlay across the talks, I want to pause and see if the panelists have things that you want to comment on to each other, and then we'll be sure to quickly turn it over to our audience here.
Wow, that was a great summary.
Thank you.
You were good.
That's why she's a dean.
Well, we're going to open the floor up for questions.
Well, I'm the one with the microphone, so raise your hand and I'll come to you. But let me just challenge the panel as a group. One thing that I heard is the tension between personal security and larger security. So this whole notion of security dilemmas. Two things that I would raise: there was a wonderful cartoon in the Radical Press back in 1969 that showed a man in a vice, and he's looking out in the vice and he's looking at you and he says, the way I look at it, what I gain in freedom, what I lose in freedom, I gain in security. Okay? and I would use the the quote from V, from both the novel and from the film. A government should be scared of its people rather than a people scared of its government. So it's really this whole tension that ran through all of them. How do we define security? And at what level do we have to understand our security, either on a national level or on an individual level? I'm coming here for the first question.
I guess as I heard each of you, my concern is that, and unfortunately, I was in education for years, education changes so slowly. What we need is media literacy. I feel like every single one of you use the media in your talk, and yet the average American citizen does not understand the media. So I guess I would like a call for media literacy for every high school graduate. Comments or not?
Comments?
Yes.
Well, I have to say my students are ahead of me in their understanding of media, and they are often my best informants on these kinds of issues. So it could be that there's a generational divide, because as I said, I'm not sure I could even keep up with them at this point.
But I'm not talking about the speed of it. I'm talking about, do they understand what's behind it? Do they understand that news programs are rated and they want advertising, so they put the news that's not really news, but it's do they understand those deeper issues on what they see in their media?
So, I mean, certainly when we talk about Cuba and the media, I think for many years, and maybe less so now, but for many years the media perpetuated a myth about what was happening in Cuba that was completely out of context with reality when you actually went there. And so even for me, I went with this, I had absorbed this US message about a totalitarian dictatorship, and what I found was so dramatically different that when I take my own students through the whole history of what's happened in Cuba, I use it as a metaphor actually for something much greater than Cuba, because once you learn about how we've been deceived by media and other sources of information, it forces you to challenge everything you think you know. Because when you know something really well and you see, wow, this isn't how it's being portrayed, what else out there is something that I think I know that I don't know.
Hello. Hey, thank you. This has been a really interesting talk, and I appreciate each of your perspectives. I guess to kind of piggyback off the last comment, to use a term coined by Noam Chomsky, manufacturing consent. I mean, it's kind of common knowledge now that media has been consolidated in the hands of about 6 corporations. So in terms of generating trust in the people for the government, and also to highlight the sort of false dichotomy between the separation of the people from the government, how can we bring democratic citizenry into the conversation? How can we involve individuals to manage our institutions in a way that we can have accountability for those policymakers and for media alike?
So I think that's a phenomenal question and gets a couple just absolutely core maybe changes or challenges that I think, like, I don't know, I'm old, but the next generation faces, because I failed, I haven't solved them because you asked the question. But, so one, it gets at sort of how do we learn, right? And in a changing environment of the people that supply us, supposedly with, bits that could be information or it could be candy, right? Or it could be nothing. How do we get the information that's necessary? I think that's very interesting, right? I think there's been technological changes in getting information out, but I'm not sure there's been technological innovations in technology and how we link eggheads, right? So I think we think of democracy, right? So you called it a false dichotomy between the public and the government, right? But I do think there is an important distinction between at least the executive, or the people that sit and execute laws, and the people that, are supposed to sit outside and judge, right? How they're doing. They judge too, right? But if we're talking about, trying to get unbiased sources of information, right? It's more likely to come from outside than in, but the question is, what's that boundary? Which I think is what you're getting at with the right? The aggregation of news sources and other things. But what we haven't done that well, I think, is the people outside, is get the eggheads, right, who maybe know things, right, and connect them with microphones, right, that are reaching the people that are interested, right? And I just think we have television wiring, right, sort of in the internet age, about how to do that. And so everyone can have a microphone, right, or a blog, a YouTube channel, like whatever. But then maybe the real sources of knowledge, right? There's not curation necessarily in that, or at least the curation doesn't necessarily happen in the public good, right? It happens possibly in cats, right, that look grumpy. And so I think we need to figure that out. And I have great hope, I guess, that we will. And it gets a little bit back to some of the things that we've talked about, that we are emotional, right? But we're also rational. And so we can also understand what our limitations are. And we talked about security a little bit and personal fear, right? Versus a sort of very abstract notion of national security. But one thing we can do is know that, yes, it's much easier to make all of us feel afraid, right, than it is to make us feel secure. And knowing that, right, what do we do about it, right? We can think through those things. And I just think, so my frustration maybe is similar to yours, but I just think we have hope. I have some hope that we can do those things. And I think part of the answer is the connection, I guess. But maybe just because I think of myself as an egghead, right? But that, the connection between expertise, right, and the information that people are hearing, I don't think that connection is it's what it should be.
I want to answer too. There's never been such a time when people have so much power at their disposal to attract the attention of the citizenry. I mean, right now, for example, entertainment media producers are very beholden to fans. They're forced to integrate fan response. This is a phenomenon in media. And when we think about politics, to me, what I see is a failure of creativity in the way that people are using the forms of dissent. Because I study the history of dissent, I see people trying the same kind of things. Let's go for a march. Let's write a petition. And what's lacking is the Black Lives Matter is breaking out because they've really managed to do a kind of agitprop that grabs the attention of the national media. But to me, I think there's a failure of creativity. I think what we need is more creative kinds of efforts at dissent.
So I'm going to weigh in with a practical one that's not new to anybody, but campaign finance reform can play a big role here. It really can. And back to the all politics is local, we really have to figure out a way to help people and communities that have something to say get in front of the people who will listen. And it's not always the policymaker. It may be someone on their staff, it may be someone else well placed, it may be someone in the media, but we've got to do a better job of taking what we've learned through projects in the community or in the ivory tower or in business, and you can't empower anyone. That's not the word. You can create access points so that people can get information out. So those are two very practical things that if everybody that had a mind to do it started acting on, we could begin to see change.
Okay, I've got a question right here.
Actually, three very quick things that go in reverse order. The first is a documentary that deals very nicely with what we were just talking about is, if you're familiar with it, #Regeneration. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. It's worth giving a look. #Regeneration. Another thing is, it's worth taking a look at HR 2666, if you're familiar with that, because it's something that's very likely going to throttle the FCC in communications. It's worth taking a look at too, HR 2666. But what I wanted to ask was this. It seems like another sort of common thread everybody was talking about was celebrity. I mean, there are the heroes or villains, whatever they are. If you're an anarchist, if you're a Castro, if you're Edward Snowden, if you're Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, how does celebrity play into politics for each of your four topics?
Well, I would say that it's had an impact. Is it important? Yeah, it is. It is important. We have a perception of people based on celebrity, and we feel like we know them. And people like themselves and vote for people who they think are like them, or they want to be associated. So celebrity does play a role, and we know Hillary Clinton from her years as First Lady and U.S. Senator, and Donald Trump from his reality show, and other politicians in other ways. But you know, I would say that when we talk about channels, and I want to make this point, young people get a lot of information in different ways because the channels of communication have evolved and changed. And you can watch a late night comedy show and know who's winning or losing in politics, depending on what kind of jokes or barbs are going at them. Or watch any of the Comedy Channel really good analysis where they make fun of every line back and forth. Well, you know, there's a basis of truth, and young people like it, absorb it, share it, and that's how they learn. And for me, I'm going to vote. I'm old. Old people vote. Young people haven't proven that they do yet. But if you know I'm going to vote, you can reach me on TV. And that's why campaigns are so expensive, because television costs a lot of money. And we don't cut them any slack. We actually charge politicians a lot more because we don't like them. There's a lot of advertising clutter. And you know what? Maybe that's okay. And maybe the guy with the most money gets his ideas out. And that's part of democracy and politics too. That's the system that we've created. You may not like it, but it's the world that we deal with right now.
Okay, in answer to that question, Donald Trump is pure celebrity. I mean, we've had, because he made frequent appearances on like Fresh Prince of Bel-Air and The Jeffersons and all of these sitcoms, and then he had The Apprentice, and then, and he's definitely a construct. He carefully constructed his celebrity, and we can think of like other actors like Ronald Reagan or Arnold Schwarzenegger who took positions of power, but they had some political experience. They had some experience in government, but Trump is just pure celebrity.
And I mean, I shudder to compare Trump to Fidel Castro. And I really thought of Castro in terms of celebrity. The charisma is the word that I would use. And I would also posit that I don't think the Cuban Revolution would have been possible without him. That he embodied what the people wanted, but in a way that they could see it. He was a real, he ignited the population, and they adored him. So that's what's been sort of the underlying theme that's allowed Cuba to continue as it has, as long as it has.
Raise your hands, but I've got a question right here, right now.
Okay, so campaign finance reform is important only because we have two dominant parties. But if either or both of the dominant parties break up, we've got a chance of being heard if we institute approval voting district by district. It's invented by statisticians. It's rating all the candidates on a 0 to 5 system. And also, the Black Lives Matter, I take strong exception to your comments. I'm active in the local Black Lives Matter movement. They're very creative. They're doing a lot of great things with My Brother's Keeper.
That's what I said.
Okay, it sounded like you were saying they were not. As far as giving people power and having people take their power, I was scoping through Ingham County. They have 6 openings for appointed positions. You don't have to have a campaign. You don't have to know anything about politics. You just have to be willing to engage in government and learn how government works. So this business of thinking, you know, Donald or Bernie or somebody is my hero and they're going to take everything and then I can go back and play video games, that doesn't work.
Okay, I'm coming up here. Any comment before I hand it over?
So you're talking about that you see a lack of connection between academic research and the people. Like, how do we get the people the information about which policies are working, which ones aren't working? The cable news isn't working to get that information across to the people. So there's this like gulf between, so the public can't hold the government accountable. So I don't consume, like, I'm young, Yeah, I'm like only 18. So I don't consume any cable news channels. Like I don't turn on the TV. Like me and my friends, we all consume everything like through our phones, and most people now have smartphones. And it makes a wide range of information accessible. So for me, like I use my phone to access research and things like that, but also it's really easy for people to just Google their side of the argument, find a blog post or actual research that supports their side of the argument and not learn about the other side of the argument. And a lot of times people tend to lean towards like more blog posts than actual like academic research, because it's easier to read. And sometimes we talk about in my classes how we have a little bit of like anti-intellectualism in the US. So what do each of you do as experts to get your expertise to the public?
So I think that's a wonderful question. We're all thinking that's a wonderful question, I think. So I'll tell you personally, so I blog a little bit when I think I have something worthwhile to say, despite me, so I get what you're saying, right? But you're young and I'm old. I also don't have cable, right? And I also get sort of all my news and information, right, on my smartphone, right, and other ways. But as an academic, right, I have to say I find it very challenging, right, you know, being the translator, right? Because I don't, so there's two incentives I think people have to understand if you want academics, right, to be the ones that sort of run to the current problems, is one, that's not our comparative advantage, right? The ambulance chasing, like figuring stuff out like really quickly, like that's not what we're good at. We're good at like sitting around and thinking for a long time about like hard, deep problems and getting it wrong a bunch of times, right? And figuring out what's right and wrong and hopefully eventually coming to something useful. And then every once in a while, that useful knowledge, right, becomes practically useful, or, you know, things that we study. Because I think these are hard, like social problems, politics, it's all politics hard, I think. It's very complicated. I don't think there's a solution or an easy solution to very many of these things that we've talked about today. And so I think it can't just be like academic, because I think what you'll get are people just sort of chasing the current problem and hyping, right, you know, results that they might have that aren't necessarily the best science or the best policies that are ongoing. So I think it does have to be a dialogue, right, where you have to have somebody in the middle who knows and can understand and can sort, right, you know, not based on necessarily like PageRank in Google, right, but actually on the evidence, right, that's underlying the different research, and then write a blog post about that, right, and why it's convincing. And I think there are aggregators. I definitely think there's a kind of an upcoming generation of academics that are kind of maybe moving out of active research, but are very, very good judges, you know, to some extent, that can play that role, and I hope they do in that forum. But I guess that's my long answer to a very good question.
I think there are lots of professors blogging, like the guy who runs Instapundit. He's a libertarian conservative. He's a law professor in Tennessee, or I can think of lots of professors who run really, really successful blogs. And then the New York Times often invites professors to comment on various hot topics or write articles there. So it's there for the seeking.
And I do a lot of writing op-ed pieces. That's how I feel like I disseminate my information beyond those books that only academics read.
My role has actually been in talking truth to power and in being in the room with people and telling them, hey, that's really stupid. Don't do that. Don't say that. Do this. Getting celebrity or people who are engaged in government to be persuaded and changed is really hard. And again, usually we go to where people are at. Well, it means that we tend to, rather than persuade, just give into this theory of cognitive dissonance that we're only going to accept information that kind of agrees with our opinion and what we think anyway, and we're not going to open our minds to listen to a lot of different things. It's really hard to, in a day, if you've got to pick up your laundry and drop off your kids and run to class and do all of these other things that anyone here would do, to think about the issues and vote. We want simpler solutions. So people are communicating in simple ways, and that's how we've evolved and changed over time.
This question's for Donna. If I heard you correctly, that the rise in the Cuban economy is, at least in part, due to the increasing privatization of business. The question is, how do you square that with the rising distrust in our country of privatization, such as one's based on profit motive, such as privatization of prisons, for instance?
So what's happening in Cuba is absolutely fascinating in terms of the economy. There's an increase in privatization in very specific sectors that have been determined by the government. But what's the problem that's occurring is that Cubans who have access to hard currency have the ability to have their own businesses. So what we've seen is who left Cuba after the revolution? What were the shades of colors of those people? Many of the people who left who were opposed to Fidel Castro were white. They came to Miami. They've made it more or less in the US. Many, many Cubans have done very well here. And now those are the Cubans who are sending money, resources back to their relatives in Cuba. So what we're seeing happen in Cuba is an increase in inequality that also accompanies race. And so that the people who are making money in the Cuban economy now tend to be white, and the people who are losing in Cuba tend to be black. It's a problem that I think is pretty transparent to Cubans. They're aware of what's happening. And yet the conversation, and I am having this conversation constantly with my black and white Cuban friends, they don't know what to do about it. They need to change the economy in such a way, and probably, in my opinion, increase taxes on those private businesses to recirculate some of that money to return to sort of the more equal redistribution of resources.
Well, first comment, I would have liked to have seen a couple of additional members of the panel. I think religion plays an integral part in politics around the world. When you look at any of the conflicts, that is a big part of what's going on. And also on propaganda, because propaganda is a big part of politics, and the inability of people to understand really what's going on in their own government and world. For instance, think tanks, all they do is sit around and figure out how to pull the wool over the public's eyes. So what I would like to, well, Ronald Reagan, I think, was the downhill slope to where we're at, and he's always touted as this great leader, but he gave us the fairness doctrine, which prevented us from hearing both sides of an argument in the public forum. That's where Limbaugh and the gravitation to reinforcing of our own personal ideas and prejudices rather than having an open mind. So I would be curious that with Bob Colt, your impression of the fact that the media has become infotainment rather than information, and that much of it has been geared to deceiving the public and to reinforcing the propaganda of the government and the corporations. And as this man here said, it's been reduced to about 5 major corporations, really, that now dominate it. And I think those are very important aspects to why we are in the situation we are. And I think what we've seen is, in this election, people are waking up and they're finally caring about things and they're paying more attention.
So you use the word propaganda, which in the College of Communication would be communication with an intention to deceive or control. And I would say that that's an accurate definition